Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our spring lecture series, Sites of Memory in Asia. I am Xiaojin Wu, Atsukiko and Aina Goodwin Tateuchi Foundation Curator of Japanese and Korean Art here at the Seattle Art Museum. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge we're on the traditional homelands of the Duwamish and the customary territories of the Squamish and Muckleshoot people. As a cultural and educational institution, we honor our ongoing connection to these communities, past, present, and future. We also acknowledge the urban native peoples from many nations who call Seattle their home. As the year 2020 witnessed removal of over 100 public monuments in different parts of the world, we conceived the topic of this series, Sites of Memory, to take a critical look at some poignant history of building or demolishing monuments in Asia. The 4 talks in this series offer case studies in North India, Japan, West India, and China. Each will reveal a highly charged story. So please come joining us every Saturday morning, 10 to 11:30 in April. To our long-standing partners for Saturday University lectures, the Jackson School for International Studies at the University of Washington and the Alec Bay Book Company, we would like to give our special thanks. And I would also like to add a thank you to our coordinator, Linnea Hodge, and AV manager, Sophia Zimmerman, for their indispensable behind-the-scenes work. And after the lecture, please write your questions in the Q&A. And after the Q&A, a brief survey will pop up on your screen. We would really appreciate it if you could fill it out. Next slide, please, Sophie. Recordings of last lecture series, Art and Renewal in Times of Crisis in Asia, are available on Sam's YouTube channel. So if you go to Seattle Art Museum YouTube and click Playlist tab, you should be able to find Saturday University lecture series recording there. Next slide, please. Now it's my pleasure and honor to introduce our speaker today, Professor Alice Tseng, currently Chair of History and Art and Architecture at Boston University. Professor Tseng specializes in the art and architecture of Japan with a focus on the 19th and the 20th centuries. Her research interests range from the history of institutional buildings, collections, and exhibitions to transnational and transcultural connections between Japan and Euro-America. Her first book, Imperial Museums of Meiji Japan, Architecture and the Art of the Nation, is a pioneering work that not only examines Japanese museum architecture in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but expands to broader concerns of empire, nationhood, and modernity. Today's lecture, Building Ancient Memory in Modern Kyoto, draws from her second book, which is titled Modern Kyoto, Building for Ceremony and Commemoration, 1868 to 1940. Now, without any further ado, I'm turning over our virtual podium to Professor Tseng.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Xiaojin. Let me start sharing my screen here. All right, and let me set myself up, make sure I have a laser pointer. Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to join you today if you're on the West Coast. Or good afternoon if you're on the East Coast where I am in Boston. It's a wonderful way to connect with everyone through Zoom during our very unusual times. And I'm very happy to be invited by the Seattle Art Museum and to be able to share a little bit of my work, and especially to be part of a series called Sites of Memory in Asia. These are, it's a great theme that I touch upon quite a bit in most of my work up to this point. So as Xiaojun was so kindly to introduce me, this is taken from my second book, but these are actually subject matters that I've thought about through actually more than 10 years up to this point. So I hope that many of you have actually visited Kyoto, and a bit of this talk will bring some fond memories back of your visit. So here we go. The lecture I titled Building Ancient Memory in Modern Kyoto. And let's get started with a scene that might be familiar to you if you ever visited in late October, visited Kyoto. So this is what's called the Jitai Matsuri, or if you translate it, it's called the Festival of the Ages. It's an annual occurrence. It happens every October. And the key feature of this festival is that there's a historical procession. It's now several thousand people in the procession. They are dressed in period costumes from specific historical times of Kyoto. And what's even more special about this procession is that the people involved in the parade are actually regular Kyoto people from various different school districts of the city. And so the parade shows the history of the city from its founding in the late 8th century and goes all the way up to the middle of the 19th century. What I'm more interested in showing you right this moment is the building behind them. Today, the parade starts at the Imperial Palace, and then they make a procession of around 2 kilometers to end at this building here, which is Heian Shrine, which is the protagonist of the lecture today. And so they're even though this beginning and end point aren't exactly original to this procession, it didn't always start at the Imperial Palace. I think at this moment, the connection between the palace and the shrine is now etched in people's minds, and for good reason, because there are many connections between palace and shrine through this procession. Because number one, architecturally, both the Imperial Palace and Heian Shrine, they look like they're buildings that date from the founding period of the city. So they look like they're very old architecture. The second thing that ties this palace and shrine together is that they're intimately connected to imperial authority and culture. The palace obviously being the residence of the emperor, or used to be, while this particular shrine is dedicated to the memory of 2 emperors, both Emperor Kanmu and Kome. And so the third thing that ties this palace and shrine together is probably more surprising if you don't know a whole lot about these 2 structures, is that neither of them is old, at least not old compared to the rest of Kyoto. Both the current Imperial Palace and the Heian Shrine, the architecture dates from the second half of the 19th century. So in Kyoto time, that's very young, because they're just over 100 years old, which is nothing compared to the age of the whole entire city. The city itself is more than 1,200 years old. So that's herein lies the interest of this lecture, where if right here you're taking a look at the map itself of this procession for the Festival of the Ages, you see that they start at the Imperial Palace, make their way around down the main thoroughfares, and then crossing the Kanmu River, and then make their way back up to Heian Shrine. The focus today will start with a little bit of attention to the Imperial Palace, but ultimately our final destination is Heian Shrine, kind of like a procession itself. So we're interested in the creation of the shrine. It was established in the 1890s. The shrine itself was the catalyst for establishing the Festival of the Ages. It houses imperial deities. So I already said that at this moment, 2 emperors are deified there. But at its starting point, it was only one of them. And then the shrine, the festival, the procession itself, they were all conjoined inventions starting in 1895. And so that urge to make this fresh connection to the imperial house and its very long lineage in the city of Kyoto was the main reason for the modernization of Kyoto. And that sounds kind of ironic, but we'll go through all that in today's lecture. At this point in time, by the 1890s, the imperial family, the emperor himself especially, no longer lived in Kyoto. The emperor had left permanently in 1869. The rest of the household moved with him permanently to Tokyo. So after the imperial family's departure, all the major nobility houses, any warrior families who were living there in Kyoto, basically everyone was asked to move along with the imperial family to Tokyo. So it was a huge exodus of the elite of the city. And that really created an identity crisis for Kyoto, because for the longest time since its creation back in the year 794, the identity of the city was the emperor's city. You know, that's how the existence of the city was based upon. So for more than 1,000 years, suddenly they faced this change in 1869, where what would they call themselves? How could they continue to be an imperial city if the emperor wasn't there living in the city anymore? So that was the big crisis. So to start answering the question of how do you continue being an imperial city without having the emperor, we have to really go back to the beginnings of the city. Some of you might already know a bit about it. So if it's just a refresher for you, bear with me. The city has a very clear founding moment. The year 794 was when the Emperor Kanmu decided to relocate the capital from the last capital. The last one was Nagaoka. And 10 years before that, Kanmu actually started back in Heijo. That's a city that's today known as Nara. So Kanmu moved a lot, slightly unusual. So he went from Heijo to Nagaoka, and then Nagaoka to what at the time was called Heian. Heian, it was the official name of Kyoto when it was founded. So when he moved the capital over in the year 794, the capital, as you're seeing on your screen on the left here, it was designed to be like the earlier capitals. It was formed after the Chinese imperial model. So it was an ideally planned city. It's gridded. It was a fully formed rectangular. And then what you see in this red rectangle here is that would be the entire imperial precinct. So not only the residential portion, but also the administrative and ceremonial part of the kind of the imperial section of the city. So the rest of the Kyoto kind of gravitated around this central point. And right now, we really only know this beginning point of the city in a diagrammatical fashion, like what you're seeing on the screen, because we don't have enough still existing of that original Heian to know a lot more about it. So the problem was that there were a lot of total destruction, a lot of fires, both natural and due to war. And so the whole, or most of the city got burnt down several times since its time, since its founding time. And so that's why we're just, we don't have a whole lot left from its original time period. And this fact will have to come back to us when I talk about the rebuilding later on. Here, the comparison I wanted to make for you is if we're looking at founding moment for the city, and now we compare it to the right to what it looks like, the satellite view from today, you'll see that if you situate yourself through this major river of Kyoto, Kanmu River here versus Kanmu River here, you can see right away that the Imperial Palace section has moved quite a bit towards the east. And that's because it did move, that because of all the multiple major fires and the rebuildings, ultimately by the 14th century, the Imperial Palace did shift quite a bit to the east. And so what we see today was that shift that ultimately occurred in the 14th century, and it remains there today. The other thing that I want to show you through this comparison of founding moment and today is the way that a lot of the city did move and expand a lot more compared to its original time. And so that while originally it was very much to the west of the river, you can see that today it's really expanded as far out in multiple directions as possible. The only limitation would be the mountain range on the west, north, and east sides. Okay, very quickly, we also want to see exactly what kind of dramatic changes happened after the Emperor Meiji left Kyoto in the 1860s. That compared to up till the height of the Asia-Pacific War in the 1940s. So right before Emperor Meiji left, we still see the same thing where most of the city is concentrated to the west of Kanmu River. By the time at the height of World War II, we can see that that's no longer the case. Modernization, expansion has happened quite a bit. And you can see that in the fork of the river, north of the palace, east especially, which is where we'll concentrate ourselves today, that has filled out quite a bit compared to earlier in the 1860s. So we will talk about that quite a bit today. So what we see of Kyoto, what we know of Kyoto today really is the result of kind of 80 years of very active expansion and modernization. And that's why it seems to be the way it is today. It's not due to centuries of buildup, as some people might misunderstand. So here, a comparison to, again, the same two maps, but to today, one more time. The only difference between the 1940 and now is that there's even further development down south. And that's because there's no mountain that's limiting that kind of sprawl southward. Here, I want to tackle the identity aspect of Kyoto. So what was Kyoto like before Emperor Meiji left? That's kind of always an interesting question, because depending on how much you know about the preceding time period, the Edo time period, you might kind of know about Kyoto in different ways. As far as I can tell, based on the research I've done, and also looking at a lot of popular travel guides and prints, like the two that you're seeing here, Kyoto was a tourist destination. It was a place that people truly enjoyed going to. And in pictorial representation, usually Kyoto would be represented by the Imperial Palace. Like when artists needed to show that Kyoto is the place, the Imperial Palace shows up quite a bit as kind of the place marker. And so here on the left, you can see the kind of a nice bird's eye view of the major buildings of the Imperial Palace. This was when the emperor still resided there. And on the right, a less famous series of the 53 stations, but by the famous designer Hiroshige. You can see he as well shows a view of the Kyoto Palace as the view that defines this final stop in the 53 stations. What I also want to ask you to pay attention to is the fact that the Imperial Palace in both of these illustrations is not shown as a quiet, still space. You can see that there are a lot of people walking around on the outside and even some people on the inside. And here, same with the close-up view, a lot of people, especially nobles, courtiers who are kind of going about their everyday business. That's what I wanted to kind of call your attention to. Kyoto, before the emperor left, was always shown as a very active, bustling city. Even the Imperial Palace itself, although a very solemn and official space, it would still be shown in popular artwork as a very lively area. And in fact, in the tourist guide books of the time, that's where people are urged to go and check it out if you're interested in seeing a number of people dressed in kind of elite courtier clothing. This is where you can go and see these wonderful kind of people of that area. And so the one thing that I wanted to kind of add to this impression of the pre-1869 era of the palace is that there was a huge fire and there were always huge fires. But one that was closest to this time took place around the 1855 and needed the total rebuilding of the main Imperial Palace zone. So actually in between the timing of these two illustrations, there was a chance to redo the major structures of the palace. And that what's interesting in this 1855 rebuilding was the thought that they wanting to rebuild these main structures so that they look once again like the Heian period original, meaning the original palaces that were occupied by Kanmu and emperors of that time from the founding period. Now, to us, that doesn't sound like a big deal, but to them, that was a big deal because it was very hard to revive the Heian period style because there wasn't a lot of information available to understand what those original styles and structures look like. And so there was that conscious attempt. How successful, no one quite knows, except that they thought they were trying to revive Heian period style as much as possible. So moving forward in time, once again, getting into the 1860s I wanted to explain why there were always quite a number of these figures walking around the Imperial Palace. There was a very practical reason for that, because if this is the Imperial Palace proper, you can see in this larger rectangle area surrounding it, all these different plots here, different colors. These were before 1869, before the emperor left, these were all individual homes of different noblemen. So depending on how highly ranked you are, you would have a home closer to the the emperor's residence. Right, so here, right around, immediately surrounding the imperial palace, you would have the Katsura family, the Konoe family, the Ichijo family, for example. And so that's why this whole zone would be quite lively, because there would be more than 200 households basically living right next to the emperor. And so the coming and going, the everyday activities, their servants coming and going, they themselves having to come and go, that was what added to kind of the liveliness of this center zone for the city. And for the rest of the people in the rest of Kyoto, they, even if they didn't get to see the emperor regularly, his existence was always very real to them. And then they also experienced it because many of them, their livelihoods had direct or indirect connections to supporting whatever the family's everyday needs were. They were suppliers or servants. So that would have been kind of the culture of the city. Everywhere else in Japan at the time, people may not even know who the emperor was, but in Kyoto, the emperor was a very real living presence. That's why it was such a huge crisis for the city when the emperor and all of these people left along with him. Okay. So the emptying of the center part of Kyoto after 1869, it wasn't just an identity crisis. That was bad enough. But it was also an economic and urban crisis. Economic crisis, as I've already hinted at, everyone's livelihoods was based on serving, the emperor or whatever it was, whether it was, textiles or even, food, all sorts of things, all the various different trades of the city. So losing that whole bunch of clientele was very hard economically. And the urban crisis was this whole center zone suddenly emptied out, all those households, more than 200 left. So this was a real problem for the city, for all the rest of them, the merchants, common people who were left behind. I show you now these two early photographs of Kyoto to kind of show this comparison where, the prints, the illustrated book showed a hustle bustle, the lively Kyoto. In contrast, interestingly, photography in its introductory period was able to capture a very still, very quiet Kyoto. And this especially of the palace grounds, where we're given kind of unprecedented visual penetration into this space that used to not be open to a regular person. Yet at the same time, we see a very quiet, empty space. And so this kind of new photography really captures that feel, even though we know it's more because photography at that time needed a long exposure time, but it really captured kind of that feeling of loneliness and stillness. But it also kind of started to create this false sense of antiquity and timelessness. Especially because at this moment, this kind of photography was meant for tourists, globetrotters, basically foreigners who were visiting Kyoto. And so they started to these photos helped them form that image of Kyoto as this just very timeless, changeless city, but one of the oldest ones in Japan, when in fact, if they were ever allowed to come just a few decades earlier, that would not be the feel of this place. And I just wanted to juxtapose a different view, a different part of Kyoto, also that same sense of stillness. So to prevent the ruin of this center area where the palace was, there was a need to basically reinvent this whole zone. What used to be the 20 plus houses was purchased by the city with the aid of money from the emperor himself. And other than the palace and another palace here, the rest of it was leveled and turned into park area. So when you go today, that's where the Imperial garden is, and it's open to the public as it was when it first was created. So that was one of the kind of first modernization efforts of the time after the departure of the emperor, to kind of create a new open park-like zone and really to kind of revive this area. The revival occurred because the city was able to start hosting a number of industrial exhibitions, and the events kind of took place right around here and then eventually down here. So that was a way to guarantee a lot of people visiting and kind of circling through the spaces. So it didn't feel like it was a dead zone, like a still zone. So that was kind of an interesting way to revive the center of the city. Here, I just want to call your attention to this body of water so that we can move on to the next slide. The water next to the palace is referring to Kanmu River. You see the palace is over here, Kanmu River over here. So this is when we shift to the emphasis of today's talk. We move across the river, and I want to now talk about this open area here, which is open agricultural fields. So despite the physical proximity to the palace, when you go to the other side of the river back then, you're kind of going to a whole other zone. Back then, the east of the river was a space of escape, escape from the stresses of the reality that belonged to the city proper. So when you go to this side, and even in the beginning founding period, back in the Heian period, when you go to the other side of the river, this is when you establish maybe temples, like religious places, so temples, maybe shrines. You can have summer retreats, basically your second home away from the stress of the city. Or if you were a hermit or a kind of literati or a literatus, then this is where you set up your, little hut to be away from everyone. So that's why it was kind of left either as actual agricultural fields or just kind of untouched lands. And so here you have the best of everything: the river, the trees, the mountains. And if you are someone who knows your vegetables, this area was also known for, are still known for, the special variety of turnip called the shogoin kabu. So this particular kind of turnip, and there's also a radish too, that came from this particular area, thanks to all this agricultural activity. So the east side of the river, I always love finding paintings that depict it. As far back as the 17th century, we have artists depicting, what are the highlights of the east side of the river. And usually you have lovely views like this. Here is one of a set of panels by the Kanmu school. And you can see this view kind of supports what I was just saying. You have the agricultural fields, you have lots of healthy trees. Here you have cherry blossoms, perfect for today and our season, and then people just picnicking and enjoying their time here. And kind of nestled in the scenery, you'll see signs of temples and shrines, in this case Kiyomizu-dera. So that's the identity of the east of the river. And then when we go forward in time into 1880, a little bit after the emperor left, we see in this view, 1880, the emperor in this triptych is shown to come back to visit his hometown. So the print itself is called kind of looking at the Eastern Mountains from kind of at the Western capital. At this point, Western capital refers to Kyoto. So what's referred to the Eastern Mountains is the scenery, this long scenery in the back right here. And I give you a detail. So what's happening here is just a number of very famous landmarks that's to the east of the river. And let me translate most of these places for you. So Kiyomizu-dera, we saw in that last painted screen, Yasaka, Botani, etc., the famous mountain, Daimonji with the Dai character there, and then Shugakuin, an imperial detached palace. So here we see that it's a string of these places, mostly religious places, nothing, or a retreat or summer home in a way. But what I want to call attention to is this spot right here. It's an awkward spot because it's where the two prints kind of come together and there seems to be nothingness. Well, that nothingness is our next destination. Dial the clock ahead a little bit, suddenly in the year 1896, what wasn't there in 1880 in that triptych just now, suddenly we seem like a mirage. We seem to have a brand new site, a brand new landmark that pops up in 1896. What's very odd is this is a very ancient looking, if you know your architecture well, this is actually a very ancient style. So a very ancient looking set of buildings that's shown up at the foothills of these Eastern mountains. It's in this Chinese imperial style. The set of buildings you can see in this painting, this 6-panel screen covered in mist and snow, almost dreamlike. And then the painting style, this up front here kind of reminds you of Maruyama Okyo's very famous pine trees in the snow. The artist here, Gyokusen, is from that lineage. So both the painting lineage and the subject matter gives us this sense of history. Some things happen and we are suddenly faced with this monument. Another very well-known artist of the day also decides to depict this mysterious set of new buildings, mysterious to us at this moment, because I haven't explained what this is. We get a more kind of ground level view looking at the same set of buildings. He shows us all the details of this building with precision, every post, every tile, every step. So here we get a better sense that this must be a real building, that this was a real space. It almost feels like he's walking you in. But nonetheless, it still feels like it popped up out of this kind of forest, this undeveloped, pristine land. I wanted to share you one more example, and if anyone knows there more of this type of painting, contact me after this lecture. I found this in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York, and surprisingly, there are two almost identical ones at the MFA Boston here as well. These are unsigned, painted on silk, but both the Met and the MFA scrolls have the exact same mounting fabric. What's surprising is they all depict the exact same subject matter in the exact same way. What I want to note is this set of buildings have the Daimonji mountain in the back, but all three paintings seem to orient the structures in a certain way to just emphasize the relationship in the back. Finally, one last example that starts to give us some clue as to what we're looking at, a postcard from the early 20th century. I give you a close-up to the detail here, where in English, the designer helpfully tells us this is called the Imperial Palace, Daikyokuden in Kyoto. So you're probably a bit confused by now because what imperial palace? Because this is not the one we were talking about earlier. Whose palace is this anyway? Well, we're put out of our misery quickly. The answer is here. If you were visiting Kyoto in 1895, there would be a lot of information tell you exactly what this building is. If you looked at an album called the Picture Album of Famous Places, you'll be introduced to Emperor Kanmu, and you'll be told that he was the founding emperor for the city. The very next page, right away, you are shown this newest landmark of Kyoto, designed to memorialize Emperor Kanmu for the purpose of the 1,100-year anniversary of the city. And that this memorial structure to the emperor was meant to look like one of Kanmu's buildings, the most important audience hall of his time. And that audience hall would have been called the Daigokuden. So this was a very meaningful year because the city was celebrating the 1,100-year anniversary, very nice round number. And so this was a project that was created just in this time when Kyoto needed its new identity to remember this important founder figure. Okay, so how do you reconstruct somebody's palace? Reconstruction is a very tough task. There are many questions. It sounds straightforward, but it's really not that straightforward. The first question was, where do we put this memorial hall? Do we put it in the original site where Kanmu's audience hall actually would have been? You can see it marked here on this map. That couldn't happen because this place now had a lot of buildings already, and there was no room for such a large audience hall. The second option was, let's put it in where the current Imperial Palace was. That was not an option either because the city just spent so much time creating the Imperial Park and preserving the Imperial Palace. So you don't want to touch that. That was just done as a project. So the third option ended up being, let's go across the river because this is where we can actually find some open land. And so symbolically, it wasn't meaningful at all to go across the river because, you know, sticking to the imperial zones on the west here made more sense. But practically, there were many reasons why going across the river would work out better. Number one, because if this was the big anniversary, the other big event that had to happen this same year was the 4th National Industrial Exhibition. For this time in Japan, huge national industrial exhibitions were the kind of the biggest blockbuster events of that era. This is when you put on a huge show with millions of visitors coming to see. And so that site was right here. So the initial thought was to put this commemorative building also to be unveiled that same year, right adjacent to it. So this is the way it is. You know, you would walk this way to visit the memorial hall, walk this way to visit the exhibition. So that would mean the building, the memorial hall would be facing the west direction. It didn't sit well. There was a bit of kind of back and forth among the organizers whether that kind of site made sense at all. And here I quickly show you the evolution where the designers first started with a very ambitious plan to really revive the full suite of buildings called the Kyoto-in that the audience hall would be a part of. The audience hall, the Daigokuden, would be the primary structure in this huge suite of buildings. That's what Kanmu originally had. The problem was they were only given 2 years to design and build this project, and the budget was tight. And then suddenly in the middle of the project, there are some major shifts. So by the end of the project, we have a very reduced version of this revived audience hall. It became just this, the Daigokuten structure only, attached to 2 towers plus a gate structure. So you can see there's a huge reduction. Interestingly, I think the painting from the Met showed kind of an in-between stage between this highly elaborate suite and this very pared down version that we see today. And I can also add that what was built eventually was only about 62% in terms of size of the original Daigokuten. So they had to do a lot of rethinking and changing to make this project work. And the biggest problem of it all was that no one actually knew what the building should have looked like. The architects in charge, even with their knowledge of historical styles and architecture, without reliable information, without extant examples, they didn't have a whole lot to work with. So they had to rely on, bits and pieces, like, there was a picture scroll from the 12th century that didn't even exist in full anymore. And in that picture scroll, it had bits and pieces of what the palace looked like. And so that kind of detail would be used to help the architects create the full building. There was another source that was compiled in the 18th century that tried to kind of compile all the visual and textual sources throughout time that describe the palace. But this is the kind of information it offered. It kind of had diagrams and very piecemeal information. So it was really hard for the architects to use very limited kind of random bits and pieces to realize this three-dimensional reality. So you're looking at 2 of the things that the architects themselves illustrated. You can see the site plan here, the very pared down version, a lovely watercolor by Ito Chuta, one of the architects. And they themselves at the time knew that there was a lot of guesswork. They did not know what it is that they were trying to recreate. They tried their best, but the problem was the Daigokuten was the most impressive and formal type of official architecture of Kanmu's time. And there was simply no structure still standing that could help them approximate that kind of scale and style and grandeur. So all they had were maybe a couple of Buddhist temples that dated to around that time. So they went to Toshodaiji and Yakushiji in the Nara area, but there wasn't a whole lot they could work with. So very quickly, this was the debut event in 1895. People would visit the industrial exhibition. Eventually, the memorial hall got shifted into this linear formation instead of that weird adjacent placement. So you would walk through the 4th National Industrial Exhibition, and then if you kept walking, then you bumped into the memorial hall. And so this became its final orientation, a north-south orientation, which made more sense for a shrine anyway, that's one of the challenges. Middle of the project, architects were told that it's no longer just a memorial hall, it's now Imperial Shrine. And that involved a whole kind of other set of issues that I don't have time to talk about today. So here you go. You walk this way, it's like walking back chronologically through the present, the modernized Kyoto, and you can see this same thing here, the very modernized Kyoto with its industrial exhibition. But when you keep walking forward, you go to the shrine. That's the kind of the beginning point of Kyoto. So kind of this display of history was already in play during 1895. I want to go quickly because I know I should be coming to an end. Wanted to also show you this zone, this waterway is not Kamo River. It's actually a new canal that was created during this time as part of the modernization of Kyoto. So Lake Biwa, a bit far away, as you can see from the satellite map, was the source of water that the canal was newly created at this time so that Kyoto can benefit from a constant source of water. It was the hugest engineering project of this time. The city was very proud that a Japanese engineer, Tanabe Sakuro, was the one who headed this very ambitious project. And thanks to the creation of this canal, that finished by 1890, Kyoto was able to have hydroelectricity to power all the factory production that had started there. There was now a regular source of water for agriculture and definitely water for firefighting, because fires were always happening in this city and other cities in Japan, and also sanitation. So this huge project that really changed Kyoto, that modernized Kyoto, was yet another project that the Emperor Meiji himself had a hand in. He was a major patron and funded this canal project. And that's why here you see him as the guest of honor at the completion ceremony. All right, let's bring this to an end. Okazaki Park is what happens to this whole zone where Heian Shrine found its home. Very quickly after the shrine, we get a library, we get a zoo created in this same zone. This quickly became what's known as kind of a cultural center of modern Kyoto. So here I show you a diagram I made. So Heian Shrine was back here. And then what used to be the industrial exhibition zone, that was temporary. You can see that the library joined this area, the zoo. Eventually we got an art museum here. This is a playing athletic field, a public hall. So this became a true kind of new type of space for Kyoto citizens, where you go to feel enlightened and entertained at the same time. Heian Shrine itself was fully completed by 1928 when it received a proper Shinto Gateway. So it would be placed here. And that's when you are able to kind of walk through this gateway to reach the shrine. This would be a very high point for Kyoto, 1928. 1928 would be the year that the new emperor, Hirohito, was enthroned. All the ceremonies took place in Kyoto. And here, a lovely illustration that's also my book cover shows how developed Kyoto became by this point in time, 1928. Remember, before 1869, everything was to the left here, right, west of the river. You can see that in the decades that followed, a lot more happened, a lot of development. And here I only label kind of the string of sites on the east of the river that some were new, some were older, that all had very imperial connections. We start with the old detached palace, Shugakuin. We have the new Kyoto University. We have Heian Shrine, our protagonist. We have yet another big exhibition because of the emperor's enthronement. We have Yasaka Shrine. We have the new Imperial Museum down here. And ultimately, one of the newest landmarks by this time would be the mausoleum for Emperor Meiji. So Kyoto became, in a way, a very different place. But the result here is imperial history, imperial memory became very firmly etched by this point in 1928. Okay, so let's take a breath here. It's going to take a whole other book to talk about what happens to Kyoto after, 1945, the defeat of Japan in World War II. But for the sake of drawing this lecture to an end, I'll just leave you hanging at a high point for the city when it modernized and it really reached a peak point for the imperial identity of the city. I just want to end with a quick note, kind of like epilogue, and bring us back to our current time, connecting to the very first slides that I showed, connecting back to that Festival of the Ages. A festival, a matsuri in Japan, is it's religious. It's usually very directly connected to a particular shrine. So in this case, Festival of the Ages is connected to Heian Shrine. It's held every October, as I said. It's very intimately connected to the remembering of Emperor Kanmu as the founding figure of the city. And October 22nd is supposed to commemorate that founding date. The only times that that's negotiable, like changing the date or not holding it at all, is when you have events of great disaster. So during World War II, when the reigning emperor is ill, or a pandemic like what we experienced, it would be canceled. So I'll end on this note with talking about this matsuri in relationship to the other big ones in Kyoto. Today, all the information will tell you that Festival of the Ages is one of the 3 big festivals of Kyoto. It's lumped in together as if it's just as old as the other 2, the Aoi and the Gion. These are all very scenic, very attractive events to go to. The reality is those other 2 had their origins back a long time ago, one from the 6th, the other from the 9th century. Ironically, the one that is celebrating history itself, but logically is the youngest of these 3 festivals. So just end on the note of saying both the festival itself, the procession, the shrine, those are all created together back in 1895 with the political and economic and cultural renaissance of the city in mind. And it was only because of the disruption of that very long continuous history of having the emperor in residence in Kyoto that provoked this need to remember him and his lineage in a very vivid and public and collective way through the building of Heian Shrine. So I'll end there.
Thank you so much for this wonderful lecture. So here we have a question about why Emperor Meiji left Kyoto, because in your talk, everything, the building of new structures and the identity crisis all started with the emperor's departure. So why did he leave?
That's a great question. I think the emperor himself didn't even know he was going to be asked to leave. I think most people in Kyoto at the time didn't even know that was going to happen. It was a very political decision, probably not made completely with the emperor as part of the conversation. Those of you who know modern Japanese history know that modern emperors of Japan, they were not literally just figureheads, but they didn't have any political authority. They were the symbol of the nation. So the new bureaucracy that was created in his name, in Meiji's name, they felt that what used to be called Edo, but was renamed Tokyo. Tokyo had already served as the political capital for more than 250 years. And to them, it made perfect sense to continue on having Tokyo as the political center. So as Japan reached in this new internationalizing era in 1868, it was thought that logically Tokyo had to be the place for this new regime. And that's why the emperor had to leave. It just made more political and practical sense, and that's why it happened that way.
I think there's another end of this question. Japan remains one of the modern nations that still hold a monarchy, but unlike many other monarchies, Japan had 2 power centers, Tokyo and Kyoto. So at this point, at the end of 19th century, what Kyoto still held as a power center, why the emperor wanted to build new structures to kind of maintain some of the symbolic meanings, powers for Kyoto.
Right, that's a great question also. I think even in that time, even as the full move happened, the identity of Kyoto, even without the emperor, it was still a very important cultural and historical center. This is where we found a lot of the major historical sites, major, head temples, shrines. Even without the emperor in place, the city had such a long kind of buildup of all these different major cultural, religious institutions in that one place, that it wouldn't simply become defunct as a place. It was still a very important cultural and historical center. The part of that identity that needed rebuilding or just reviving was the imperial part of it. And so I think that's one of the reasons you could never kind of count out Kyoto as an important place, because of the over 1,000 years of history there that still remain there with all those sites. But also because it was a strategy in the Meiji period, the thought that if you want to use Tokyo as the political center, kind of where all the new things are happening, then there needs to be some sort of balance, right? At that moment in time when all the major nation states were kind of fighting it out amongst themselves to see who was more powerful politically, economically, there was also that third factor of who was authentic and unique, right? Especially when you're participating at international events like the World's Fairs, where you don't want to look like everyone else and show yourself as just bland, not interesting, have no foundation or roots. So Kyoto played that role for the country at the time as kind of the authentic roots, the authentic foundation that was uniquely Japanese, like nobody else. And so that was part of that identity. And the uniqueness had a lot to do with the imperial lineage, the more than a millennia of emperors and the culture that surrounded it in that city.
Yeah, it still holds some truth even today to some degree. Degree. Tori, do you have any questions, or you can pick some questions for Professor Tseng from the Q&A list?
Yes, thanks, Xiaojun. And thank you again, Alice, for such a rich and fascinating talk today. So Michael asks, is this topic covered in your book, Modern Kyoto Building for Ceremony and Commemoration, 1868 to 1940? And I wonder if, in answering this question, you could just talk about how what you've presented today fits into the scope and organizational structure of your book.
Sure. Most of what I talked about today is from chapter 1 of the book. The book has 4 chapters. So the first one really talked about reviving the Imperial Palace and then the creation of this new monument in Heian Shrine. But by chapter 2, I talked about the kind of formation of the whole Okazaki Park zone. So talking about each of the new institutions like the zoo, the library, kind of various new modern institutions to really fill out that new culture center. By the 3rd chapter, I talk about the 2 enthronements that happened in this time period, where Emperor Taisho and then Emperor Showa had their big kind of ascensions to the throne. And in the pre-war era, those events by law had to take place in Kyoto rather than Tokyo. So those were kind of the 2 huge highlights for the city, where it had everyone's attention in the year 1915 and once again in 1928. So chapter 3 talks about the the various celebrations and the urban interventions that happened for those two enthronements. And then chapter 4 talks about the permanent additions to the city to facilitate these two enthronements. So the train station was redesigned for the Taisho enthronement. There was a new botanical garden that was dedicated to the emperor's enthronement. Also, a number of various the art museum in Okazaki Park also. So that chapter traces the kind of the reason for the creation of these huge landmarks that you can easily visit today. Well, not the train station, it's out a different design. But most of what we know about Kyoto today, that's not the historical landmarks were created because of these big imperial events that happened before the war. So that ends the book at that point, where I leave the readers hanging. If people need to know more about the post-war, I'm not sure who's going to write that next book, but it's a book that should be written, Post-War Kyoto.
So here, Professor James Dobbins pointed out the imperial household had strong historical ties with the Okazaki area through the ancient Rikushoji temples. So he was wondering if there's any connection used to make the argument that that site was appropriate for the new Heian Shrine.
Right, and that's a good point. Yes, that whole zone wasn't always simply, you know, rice paddies and agriculture fields. It did definitely have the retirement kind of the Insei regime at some point early, actually, in the Heian period. That whole zone also, unfortunately, was completely destroyed at some point later on. Reading the sources that I did from the Meiji period, I'm not recalling a lot of specific mention of that part of the history. I think by Meiji period, there was more an emphasis of kind of the new things that they were doing on that east side of the river, kind of the rewriting of that zone's history to match what the Meiji regime was doing to it. And so, you know, it's interesting, they really could have made that connection, but I don't remember it being mentioned much, if at all. But yes, definitely that whole area did have an actual historical connection to the imperial family.
Yeah, so talking about the role of the Meiji government, it was really interesting to see your slides, how scaled back the Daikokuden became after the Ito Chuta's original kind of drawing. And also it's interesting to see the painting at the Metropolitan Museum that was kind of in between state. Was the construction of Daikokuden sponsored by the Meiji government? We all know, like, for any renovation or building project, you always run into budget problem and you always scale back. But was that the Meiji government behind of that? And in the larger kind of sense, how much the Meiji government played in building a new Meiji or modern identity for Japan?
Well, Heian Shrine from its beginning was always a not publicly funded. It was kind of the people's show of kind of loyalty and boosterism for their own city. So no, there wasn't government funding, at least definitely not from the central government, or from from Tokyo. It was something, so they fundraised, and all kind of major political figures did give money, but a lot of it also came from the local people of Kyoto, because this is for them, right? This is to kind of memorialize the city's history. It was for them. And so no, and up to today, Heian Shrine remains funded by its parishioners. It doesn't get funding from the government at all. So that was part of the pride of this big project, but also the problem, because there's only so much money you could raise at such short notice. They had very, very little time to do this. And also, I think site constraints were real. If you even tried to get close to original size of the Daikoku-den, remember that was the most glorious building of its time. There was no way they could have approximated that size. So even building it at about half scale, it's a pretty big building when you go see it. It's not small at all. And that's half the scale of the original. And so with all those challenges, what was realized is in a way very, very impressive, given all the things that they did not know, all the time constraint, the site constraint, the sudden shift from Memorial Hall to Shrine, and all those obstacles. So in that sense, this particular project, was not the government or central government once involved. The local government, like the city and the prefecture, obviously they're very much supportive of it, but I don't think money was, this was definitely money raised from regular people. And that was kind of what was so special about the project. And yes, the central government had a lot to do with boosting Kyoto during this time. Like I said, it was an actual national strategy to make sure that Kyoto did not become defunct or fall by the wayside. And also Emperor Meiji himself, as I emphasized, both the kind of all the big projects during this time, he put his own money in there. This was his hometown. He grew up there, and there was personal connection to this place. Very different from his son and grandson. They would really not know Kyoto at all and probably didn't care. But Meiji definitely, gave the money when needed for the palace restoration, for the canal project. And so he was considered still a very big patron of the city, even though he left. And that's why he was buried there too. He wanted to be laid to rest back in the Kyoto area, unlike his descendants who are all buried in the Tokyo area.
Sorry?
Along similar lines, Dennis asks, can you speak to the tension between the leaders of the city and trying to balance the modern, as in industrial fairs, and historical, as in the shrine and the preservation of the sort of ancient styles of architecture?
That's a great question. And I think with any city that has a long history, Kyoto has always struggled with that. And I think also the choice of putting Heian Shrine across the river has a lot to do with not disrupting the existing fabric of the city as it's already pretty built up. It would disrupt it quite a bit to try to insert something this large in west of the river. And so it made perfect sense that ultimately they picked this site, even though symbolically it didn't have a strong resonance the way it would have if they sited this back on the original site where Kanmu had his Daikoku-den. So I think Kyoto continues to struggle with that. How do you balance preserving history and moving forward? Depending on who you ask, some people would say Kyoto's doing a great job, and others would say, no, it's terrible. Look at the tall buildings, look at that funny train station and that Kyoto Tower object across from the station. I think, every person has a slightly different interpretation of whether Kyoto balanced it properly. But as a city, I think more and more in the last couple decades, the city has enforced more and more laws restricting kind of extreme development, anything that would hurt the view, like kind of like the skyline or just kind of the view of the city. If a building's too large, too tall, that blocks, especially if you block the sight of the surrounding mountains, that's no longer allowed. So the city has done a lot more, I think, in the last couple decades to prevent kind of ruining the look of the city than, let's say, in the immediate post-war. The immediate post-war, there weren't as many restrictions, but more has been done now. So it's very much, Kyoto is very much a touristic destination, especially relying more and more on foreign tourists. And so kind of keeping Kyoto attractive as a unique site is also a driver behind this idea of having to preserve as much as possible.
So we have a couple of questions that I think can be combined. Ping asks about the differences in identity between East and West, if there was a sense of differentiation between urban versus wilderness on the east and west sides of the river. And then we have another question about the development on the eastern bank and if that required seizures of private property in order to develop it.
I think the east and west divide was more obvious before the Meiji period, definitely, where you really can sense that the only things you see on the east side would be the major temples that still are there today, temples and shrines. The second part of that question is a good question, whether anyone's been, I don't want to say I know for sure, but I don't think so. I think what was there wasn't a whole lot there other than the major temples and shrines and the agricultural fields, as far as I know. And then with the canal kind of cutting through like that, at first along the canal route, they were thinking of putting all the factories there, actually, because they're the ones who needed the water for powering. But then when they put in the hydroelectric plant as kind of this last minute change of mind, instead of, kind of to make things much easier for powering, they realized they no longer needed to put the factories right along this canalway. And then it became kind of like a scenic zone where you have this lovely waterway, and then very wealthy people started to be invited to put kind of their second homes, their vacation homes around this new canalway. So that's why you have the famous Murinan that's there right now. You can, as a tourist, go and visit. And so that, I know about that, sort of, instead of pushing people, kind of newer people coming in to create kind of very scenic second homes around this new waterway. Even though the waterway itself is modern, it kind of added to the scenic or pretty look of that zone, even though originally it would have looked awful with all the factories that were meant to be there.
And here's a question about nationalism in the late Meiji era. So is any of these changes relate to nationalism or other issues with Sino-Japanese War, the 1895 Sino-Japanese War? I think you talked about in your book, but maybe you can share more here.
You mean developing Kyoto as part of a nationalist movement? Is that the question?
I think, yeah, building the new structures in Kyoto and
right,
kind of
yeah,
a new
I think so. I think anytime when you're talking about pre-war Japan, when Japan was actively expanding as an empire and kind of doing more and more to kind of raise up the profile of the imperial family, the imperial lineage, that definitely is part of the nationalism of that time, where it's not simply this neutral, we love history, look at this long lineage, but in the pre-war period, worshiping the emperor, any emperor, that is part of that programming of, raising up the profile of the reigning family, that so-called, unending, uninterrupted line of imperial, of family that ruled over Japan. So yes, there's definitely a very strong message there of, this is what makes Japan special and unique because of this uninterrupted lineage of, emperors, and Kyoto becomes the center of that, right? Because that is the home of a founding figure of that city, which ironically, Kyoto was not the first capital by any stretch of the imagination. There were, 49 other emperors before Kanmu. Some of them are mythical, but Kyoto was the easier spot to highlight because it was the capital for so long. In comparison, anything earlier than that, the cities didn't last that long. And so Kyoto, which, yes, I do say that more in the book, was in a way a hotbed of that kind of imperial culture, not because it was simply charming, but it was a very political identity as well to justify that process of taking over the rest of Asia, because Japan was special, and that was the way it was being defined. It was special because of this uninterrupted lineage of emperors.
Great. Tari, do you want to ask the last question maybe?
Sure. Well, we have a couple questions about destructive factors. You talked a lot about sort of places being destroyed and altered. And Emily asks, why were there so many fires? Does that have to do with building materials? And we have another attendee who asked about the effect of earthquakes, whether earthquakes have changed the topography or the architecture of the city.
Right. Fires would be the main cause of most of the big destructions in Kyoto, like any other big city, Edo as well. Fires, it could be kind of accidental fires, or a lot of the time in the long history of Kyoto, it was fires set on purpose because it was a civil war. And that's kind of part of that fighting, where you kind of set buildings on fire and destroy and kill. And so that was the reason that Kyoto, even though it's so old, even though we expect to have these remnants from a long time ago, there aren't really buildings still standing, at least not that many from the Heian period, because of that, because the architecture is mostly wooden and it just burns and disappears. And so that's, yes, so the wood had a lot to do with it, but most of it is also the intentional burning because of the repeated kind of wars, the major ones that did happen here in Kyoto. In terms of earthquakes, yes, there obviously would be issues there, but earthquakes lead to fires. And so the quake itself might kind of destroy a structure, but it's when there are open fires, let's say someone's cooking or doing something with fire at that moment, then that kind of leads to the spread of fire. And so the real destruction happens because of the fire, even if it's related to earthquake. I forget, was there a second part to that question after the fires? And
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think we are at time. And thank you again, Alice, for such a revealing lecture about modern Kyoto. And please join us next week at the same time for the third lecture of this series, The Memory of the Ancients in Modern Iranian and Parsi Architecture by Professor Talin Grigol at the University of California, Davis. So hope to see you again next week. Thank you again, Alice.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. Thank you for coming today.
Thank you for joining us, everyone.